somewhat more general, was another new global theme. Has to be phrased carefully, but I think it's a valid one. Another new global theme of a need to figure out how to respond to the West. Western power by the middle of the 19th century was so palpable, was so unavoidable, that virtually every major society, or some segment of it, had to begin discussing, what are we going to do about it? How can we get rid of the West, resist the West, and what do we need to change in order to do so? And what do we need to change that might imitate at least aspects of Western development itself for the opportunity to regain or preserve some degree of regional independence? An early illustration of this new sense of a need to change in order to resist the West occurred in the aftermath of Napoleon's invasions, occurred in Egypt, where a new leader in the early 19th century, Muhammad Ali, effectively moved Egypt toward de facto independence from the Ottoman Empire and undertook a path of reform that he hoped would bring industrialization and modern political and economic conditions to Egypt, allowing it to retain independence from the West, which was otherwise clearly threatened. Muhammad Ali sent scores of Egyptian students to European schools to learn engineering, modern science, and other technologies. He sought to encourage Egyptian industry. He sought to encourage new kinds of cash crops in Egyptian agriculture, such as cotton. It was an extremely interesting effort, but it was also extremely interesting that this early attempt largely failed. Western pressure, the limits of resources in Egypt itself, tended to confine the durable results of this reform movement to the production of new cash crops that could serve the world market. Egyptian industrialization was not in the cards at this point, but again, it was a revealing episode. Slightly later, the Ottoman Empire itself would undertake patterns of reform, seeking to redo its constitutional structure, to at least admit some new types of political institutions in the Western model, seeking to streamline its bureaucracy, seeking to create a more efficient, forward-looking bureaucracy, seeking to improve and modernize its educational system. Again, these reform movements, which crested in the late 1830s and again in the 1870s, had mixed results. They were not ungenuine, but they obviously also did not move the Ottoman Empire to a position of reversing its pattern of difficulty in face of Western interference and objections. Russia would launch a major reform movement, beginning with the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, leading not only to this emancipation, but to significant new local political institutions, reforms of Russian law toward a reduction in the severity of punishments, codification of law, efforts to spur industrialization, and by the 1890s, Russia was indeed launched in a significant industrialization process, one of the first such processes to take hold outside of the West proper. Reform, in other words, was in the air. However, and this is where the complexity has to enter in, while I think it is fair to say that world history in the long 19th century, particularly the second half of the long 19th century, is partly framed not just in terms of new Western industrial power and military interference, but in terms of efforts at reform and reaction. It is important to recognize two things. First of all, Western power affected different regions differently. Some were held, like India and increasingly Africa, as outright colonies. Some were simply targets of interference, like China, and people have debated whether it wasn't actually better for a while to be a colony than to be a target of external exploitation, the way China was. European contact varied. So did traditions and 19th century conditions. China, although this is not really totally predictable from earlier Chinese history, China responded slowly and long inadequately to the reform pressure. And only in the 1890s does a real reform movement begin to catch hold in China. This is, again, partly because of traditional resentment of outside interference in models, partly because of the outside interference itself, partly because Chinese governments at this point were exceptionally ineffective, and one of those downward spins in the Chinese political process that occurred periodically. This was obviously quite a different response from that of Russia or Japan, a comparison that we'll take up a bit later, and even from the Ottoman Empire. Responses varied, and it is vitally important to recognize this variety and recognize that even at the crest of European power, world history needs to be seen in terms of interactions and not simply imposition. Nowhere, even in its starkest colonial holdings, did the West simply impose conditions on other societies. There were always reactions, always combinations, always resistances, and in this sense, the richness of world history, the need for comparison and variety, continues quite strong, even in a century that in broad outline seems particularly simple, i.e. imperialism and European dominance. One final facet of the long 19th century I think is worth mention, even though, frankly, it's a subordinate theme, and that was the tentative emergence of new kinds of international institutions and arrangements that accompanied industrialization and the increasingly global qualities of the world economy. Let me mention a couple of particularly salient developments. It was soon after the middle of the 19th century, for example, that the Universal Postal Union was formed. A series of agreements dominated by Western players speaking on behalf of the whole world that allowed individual nations to agree on how to transmit mail from one society to the next. We now obviously pretty much take international postal service for granted, except in times of chaos or revolution. But it's really only in the later 19th century that this international facility came into being. It was soon after the 1860s as well that the International Red Cross formed. Initially, again, a Western organization primarily, but one that began to help set standards not just for medical activities during wartime, but for broader agreements that other societies would gradually adhere to, that at least on paper sought to regulate some of the worst effects of modern war, particularly in areas such as treatment of the wounded and treatment of prisoners. Other international agreements allowed, obviously, technological developments such as the laying of undersea cables, etc. Western dominated, in one sense, a facet of imperialism itself, the fact that international agreements were beginning to come into being, and one could mention also at the very end of the 19th century, the emergence of a new world court in The Hague. These developments were at least preliminary hints of a partial international political structure that was itself a marked innovation. International connections were also furthered, of course, by the development of not only of new technologies, but of new transportation arrangements. The cutting of two great canals in the long 19th century, first the Suez and then the Panama, were huge developments, facilitating international contact and trade. This obviously fits the spread of the world economy model, but it deserves separate notice because, again, you're talking about new kinds of global connections that could go beyond trade. The 1880s, again toward the end of the long 19th century, the 1880s saw the emergence of a new series of private international non-governmental organizations dealing with issues such as women's rights, white slavery, problems of this sort, and again, we'll touch on some of this in our next session as well. This first spate of what we would now call international NGOs was another sign that people, always first from the West, because the West was the dominant player still, that people were beginning to think in terms of new kinds of international connections that would relate to the world economy, but that would go well beyond it.